Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk about what it is like to live with mental illness. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, I believe that mental illness is very difficult to understand, both on a social level as well as on a personal level. I think it is difficult to be able to talk about these things, and I think oftentimes we don't know how to approach it, and so it can be very disorienting when you have socio-political forces acting on society to create a certain homogenized response in the culture and in the people themselves. And when certain ideological boundaries are put in place, it is very difficult to understand people with different mindsets, people that might experience things like mental illness, which includes things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar, suicidal ideation, which is part of some aspects of mental illness, OCD, and a variety of things. So people with these experiences tend to have a completely different viewpoint. And often this is hard for people to understand. I also think it's hard to understand on a personal level, and I think this is because it is very easy for us to expect ourselves to be normal, quote unquote normal, to be homogenized and to be part of society in the way that they expect. But this is often not how it happens with people with a different viewpoint, and people who suffer with mental illness, and people who do not understand necessarily what they are going through. Now, I have in the past justified my schizophrenia and my bipolar as being a part of making me a better person, as making me someone who understands the world better and has a deeper nuance and perspective on things. And I think that this is valuable as a kind of theodicy, as a way of understanding evil or pain or suffering, a way of understanding what's going on in the world and in our mind. But this is not necessarily the viewpoint that we should always take, in that sometimes we should acknowledge that mental illness is definitely suffering. Mental illness is not easy. There are aspects to it that are completely meaningless, that are chaotic and function in an entropic existence. There are a lot of ways in which what we experience is not fair at all, and it's something that we technically shouldn't experience, but it doesn't stop us from experiencing it nonetheless, due to the chemicals in our brain, due to socio-political pressures and ideological pressures as well, making these things very difficult. And so I've tried to come to a conclusion where I don't feel the need to justify my illness as needing to exist for me to be a better person, or to understand the world better, or to be wiser. None of that seems to be necessary for my picture, though it is understandable why in the past and even now I may justify it in that light and assume that I have to be experiencing it in order to be the kind of person that I am today. Mental illness is very hard to live with. This is frustrating, tragic, problematic, and sad, and there are real consequences to having mental illness. So for me personally, I have spent an unexpected proportion of my life in literal pain. And I haven't always known what to do with that. And so the literal consequence of having mental illness is my suffering, in some senses, is probably heightened in a way that other people aren't necessarily privy to or don't experience, at least in the same ways. I'm not necessarily saying that I would have more suffering, but there is a way in which the type of suffering that I have is something that is completely unnecessary, something that is hard to live with, and something that doesn't make sense and has difficult consequences. In my estimation, there are many people with mental illness who end up committing suicide, who end up resorting to drugs and substance abuse, who end up having unhealthy coping mechanisms, who end up scapegoating other people, or being scapegoated by society, I should say. And you have people experience the stigma and the judgment of having mental illness, and these are real consequences of what it's like. And it's really unfortunate that this is the way that it is. But in my experience, there are real consequences to having a stigmatized discussion around something like mental illness, where people aren't talking about it, and where people aren't always understanding what is being said and what is acceptable to try to change, and how there is a way in which we do not acknowledge the troubles and the struggles and the suffering that people with mental illness have because of stigma and because they don't want to acknowledge what it's like, and because they frankly don't understand what it is like. And so this is a very difficult thing. I wanted to emphasize the point that having this kind of society where we don't talk about mental illness, and for that matter don't talk about many important things, you basically end up with tragedy. You end up with people who end up in worse situations than they could have been in. Otherwise, you get people who are suffering a lot, and I think that this is a very difficult thing to have to acknowledge, but it is very true. I have lost people that I love to suicide. I've seen people in my life, friends, family, etc., struggle with mental illness, and I've had to see them suffer, and this is very difficult, and I don't always know what to do with it. So one of the questions I ask with wondering if the suffering that I experience from mental illness is justified is whether or not my life would actually be better if I didn't have mental illness. I'm honestly not sure how to look at my life now if I didn't have mental illness and how my life would be different, but I do think that in some ways at least my not having mental illness would make my life better, and that I wouldn't have such degrees of suffering, such large degrees. I would be able to look at the world more fully and less tortured, and I think that that's important and valuable. And so while it is fair to say that having mental illness has made me the kind of person I am today, I think a better person in some ways, I also have to acknowledge the pointless suffering that's come with it, and this can definitely be a very difficult thing to have to acknowledge. So I do think in some ways my life would be better. Of course, it's a trade-off, but the reality is there would be aspects to my life that would hurt a lot less. And that is, I think, something very important to acknowledge, even if I feel as though mental illness can be useful in some ways. So it takes time to learn coping strategies, to learn skills. DBT, CBT, as examples, are ways of dealing with the world when you suffer with mental illness, or just in general with dealing with suffering in a general sense. But it takes time to learn those skills, and so when I'm dealing with mania, depression, delusions, psychosis, intense moods, destabilized moods, dipping moods, it can definitely be a very difficult thing. And I think that it takes time to develop the coping strategies and a way of living life in the best way that you can with these difficulties. And it's not something that you immediately start off knowing. I think, again, because stigma is so strong, people find negative ways of coping, and finding the positive ways of coping, I think, is even harder than just using negative coping mechanisms, and it's understandable why this is the case. It's very difficult to change something that feels deeply rooted in yourself, where you feel as though you are broken, where you feel as though you're always wrong, you feel as though you're crazy and no one's listening to you and no one cares what you think. These are very difficult things. And so I think in general, it's very important to keep in mind that at least for me and what people experience, it can be difficult sometimes to find ways of coping with mental illness. And so when people are struggling, this is why I advocate for more compassion and kindness for people that are experiencing these things, because we don't know what they're going through and we don't know what they are experiencing. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, and I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on mental illness and what it is like for me to live with it and the things that I have observed in society. I hope that you will check out my other videos, and I'm very grateful that you were able to stop by today. I'm Phoenix, and there will be much more content to come, so keep a lookout.